The polished oak benches gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The air was thick with tension, and the gallery was sparsely populated. Judge William Hargrove, a tall man with a stern face and a shock of white hair, sat atop his bench, his gavel poised as if ready to strike at any moment. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. His eyes, cold and piercing, scanned the room before settling on Marcus Wright, a young black attorney standing confidently at the defense table. Marcus, clad in a crisp gray suit, adjusted his tie and began his argument. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. My client was not even present at the scene of the alleged eviction. This is a blatant case of racial profiling. Judge Hargrove raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a thin smirk. Mr. Wright, I'm not here to entertain conspiracy theories. Your client's lease violations are well documented, and the landlord was within his rights. Marcus bristled but maintained his composure. With all due respect, Your Honor, the lease violations are fabricated. Enough, Mr. Wright, Hargrove interrupted, his voice booming. You're wasting this court's time. The gavel slammed down, echoing in the silent courtroom. Marcus clenched his fists but offered a polite, "Thank you, Your Honor," before taking his seat. The gallery whispered among themselves, and Marcus could feel their sympathetic eyes on him. Marcus's office was a far cry from the grandeur of the courtroom. Bookshelves lined the walls, crammed with law books and case files. A lone coffee mug sat precariously on a stack of papers. Marcus sat behind his desk, rubbing his temples as his legal assistant, Sheila, placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. "Rough day?" Sheila asked, her tone light but concerned. Marcus let out a dry laugh. "You could say that. Hargrove didn't even let me finish my argument. He dismissed it outright." Sheila sighed, crossing her arms. "That man's been sitting on that bench for 20 years, and he's been the same since day one. You need to document everything he does. Build a case against him." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "You really think going after a judge will change anything? It'll just make things harder for my clients." "It might," Sheila admitted, "but someone has to hold him accountable." Judge Hargrove's chambers were as imposing as the man himself. Rich mahogany furniture and leather-bound law books filled the room, and the faint smell of cigar smoke lingered in the air. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, speaking with a colleague over the phone. "I tell you, these young lawyers think they can waltz in and rewrite the rules," Hargrove said, his voice dripping with disdain. "That Wright boy, he's got some nerve. Thinks he can outsmart me." The voice on the other end chuckled. "He's just ambitious. Don't let him get under your skin." Hargrove scoffed. "He's not the first, and he won't be the last. But I'll make sure he knows his place." The lecture hall was filled with eager law students. Marcus stood at the podium, his presence commanding yet approachable. His voice carried through the room as he spoke about the challenges of practicing law in a system riddled with prejudice. "Justice isn't blind," Marcus said, pacing the stage. "It sees everything, your race, your background, your socioeconomic status. And for some of us, that means we have to fight twice as hard." A hand shot up from the audience. A young woman with glasses and a notebook asked, "How do you deal with judges who are biased?" Marcus paused, considering his response. "You document everything. You stay professional, no matter how much it burns. And when the time is right, you challenge them, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you." The room erupted in applause. The community center buzzed with activity as people gathered for a town hall meeting. Folding chairs were set up in rows, and Marcus sat among the crowd, listening intently to stories of injustice. The middle-aged woman took the microphone, her voice trembling. "My son was arrested for something he didn't do," she said. "The judge didn't even look at the evidence. He just threw him away." Marcus stood, addressing the crowd. "We need to stand together. Change doesn't come from one person. It comes from all of us demanding better." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. Sheila barged into Marcus's office, waving a newspaper. "You've got to see this," she said, dropping it on his desk. The headline read, Road attorney disrupts court proceedings. The article painted Marcus as an agitator, accusing him of stirring racial tensions in the courtroom. Marcus read it, his jaw tightening. "This is Hargrove's doing," he said. "He's trying to discredit me." "Let them talk," Sheila said. "The truth will come out." Marcus sat at the dinner table with his wife, Lisa, and their young daughter. The meal was quiet until Lisa broke the silence. "You've been distracted lately," she said gently. "Is it work?" Marcus nodded. "It's Hargrove. He's pushing back harder than ever." Lisa reached across the table, taking his hand. "Just promise me you'll be careful. You're fighting a big fight, but we need you here too." Marcus smiled softly. "I promise." The office was quiet as Marcus sat alone, staring at a framed photo of his late father, a civil rights activist. His father's words echoed in his mind. "If you don't fight for what's right, who will?" He leaned forward, grabbing a pen and a notebook. "If Hargrove wants a fight," Marcus muttered, "then a fight is what he'll get." The day ends with Marcus writing furiously, his resolve stronger than ever. The courtroom was packed this time, buzzing with reporters and community members. Marcus stood beside his client, Jamal Turner, a 20-year-old black man accused of assaulting a wealthy white businessman, Peter Garrison. Jamal, dressed in a cheap suit, looked terrified but defiant. Prosecutor Ellen Foster stood confidently, addressing the jury. "The evidence will show that Mr. Turner attacked Mr. Garrison without provocation. This was a senseless, violent act." Marcus rose for his opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about more than just Jamal Turner. It's about whether we allow stereotypes and prejudice to dictate justice." Judge Hargrove interrupted, his voice dripping with irritation. "Mr. Wright, stay on topic. This isn't a lecture on social issues." Marcus glanced at the judge, his jaw tightening. "Of course, Your Honor." As the prosecution presented its first witness, Marcus raised objections to the admissibility of the evidence. Hargrove overruled him each time, his disdain evident. The tension in the room was palpable. The fluorescent lights in the cramped community center flickered as Marcus addressed a group of concerned citizens. Jamal's mother, Angela, sat in the front row, her face a mask of worry. "I don't trust that judge," Angela said, her voice trembling. "He's already made up his mind." Marcus nodded. "I understand, but we have to work within the system to expose his bias. If we react emotionally, they'll use it against us." An older man in the back stood up. "The system's broken, Marcus. You're fighting a losing battle." Marcus took a deep breath. "Maybe, but if we stop fighting, we've already lost." The crowd murmured in agreement, though the tension in the room was undeniable. The next day, the courtroom was even more hostile. Ellen Foster called Peter Garrison to the stand. He wore a tailored suit and spoke with a polished confidence. "I was walking to my car when Mr. Turner approached me," Garrison testified. "He demanded my wallet and then punched me in the face." Marcus stood to cross-examine. "Mr. Garrison, isn't it true that you've been involved in several altercations with young men in the same area?" Hargrove slammed his gavel. "Mr. Wright, unless you have direct evidence, I suggest you tread carefully." Marcus pressed on. "I'm simply establishing a pattern, Your Honor." Hargrove leaned forward, his voice icy. "Move on, counselor." The exchange left Marcus fuming, but he masked it with a calm exterior. Judge Hargrove's dining room was opulent, with crystal chandeliers and a long mahogany table. He hosted a small gathering of influential community members, including Peter Garrison. "To justice," Hargrove toasted, raising his glass of scotch, even when certain individuals try to undermine it. Garrison smirked. "Marcus Wright is a troublemaker. He's stirring up the wrong kind of attention." Hargrove chuckled. "He'll burn himself out. These types always do." The room erupted in laughter, the atmosphere smug and conspiratorial. In a bustling newsroom, journalist Claire Daniels sat at her desk, reviewing notes about Judge Hargrove. The stack of complaints against him from years prior painted a clear picture of bias, but no action had ever been taken. Her editor leaned over her shoulder. "What's the angle here, Claire?" Claire tapped her pen against her notepad. A pattern of judicial misconduct. If I can tie it to this case, we might have a bombshell story. The editor frowned. Be careful. Hargrove's well-connected. Claire smirked. That's what makes it worth doing. Back at Marcus's office, Sheila rushed in with a folder of documents. You're not going to believe this, she said, dropping the file on his desk. Marcus opened it, his brow furrowing. What is this? Records from an old case, Sheila explained. Hargrove accepted campaign donations from Garrison's father before presiding over a case involving their company. It's a clear conflict of interest. Marcus shook his head. This could discredit him, but using it will make me look desperate. We need to be strategic. Sheila sighed. Strategic or not, it's ammunition. In court, Marcus finally lost his patience. During a heated cross-examination, Hargrove interrupted yet again. Your Honor, Marcus said sharply, it's becoming increasingly clear that this court is not impartial. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Hargrove's face turned red. Mr. Wright, you are dangerously close to being held in contempt. Marcus stood tall. I'm simply stating what everyone in this room already knows. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Hargrove slammed his gavel. Order. One more outburst, and I'll have you removed. Marcus sat down, his expression resolute. The battle lines were drawn. Later that evening, Hargrove met with Ellen Foster in his chambers. The air between them was tense. You need to tighten up your case, Hargrove said. Wright's getting too bold. We can't let him win. Foster frowned. I'm doing my job, Bill, but he's poking holes in Garrison's story. Hargrove leaned forward. Then find a way to plug them. This case is bigger than just Turner. Foster hesitated, then nodded. Understood. As she left, Hargrove stared out the window, his expression a mix of anger and fear. Marcus Wright was proving to be a bigger problem than he had anticipated. The courtroom was silent as Marcus stood at the defense table, a folder of documents in his hands. Judge Hargrove sat on the bench, his face stony and unreadable. Your Honor, Marcus began, his voice steady, I am filing a motion for your recusal from this case. I believe your personal biases and prior conduct compromise your ability to preside impartially. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Hargrove's eyes narrowed, and he banged his gavel. Order in the court. He glared at Marcus. Mr. Wright, this is an outrageous accusation. Do you have evidence to support your claim? Marcus nodded and handed the folder to the court clerk. This contains records of your financial ties to the Garrison family, as well as a documented history of rulings that disproportionately harm defendants of color. Hargrove's face turned crimson. These are baseless allegations. I will not tolerate grandstanding in my courtroom. Marcus stood firm. The facts speak for themselves, Your Honor. Hargrove slammed his gavel again. Motion denied. Proceed at your own peril, Mr. Wright. Marcus sat in his office, watching the news on a small TV. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Attorney accuses judge of bias in high-profile case. A reporter's voice filled the room. The motion for recusal has sparked a heated debate, with some accusing Judge Hargrove of long-standing prejudice, while others defend his record. Sheila entered, holding a ringing phone. It's a reporter from the Daily Tribune. They want a statement. Marcus shook his head. Not yet. Let the story build on its own. We need the court of public opinion on our side before we make a move. Sheila nodded but hesitated. Marcus, you're playing with fire. Hargrove's not going to let this slide. Marcus's jaw tightened. I'm counting on it. The courthouse steps were alive with chants and picket signs. Protesters from the community had gathered, demanding justice for Jamal Turner and calling for Hargrove's resignation. A sea of signs read "Justice for Jamal" and "End Judicial Bias." Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd, listening to a young activist address the group. This isn't just about Jamal, the speaker said, her voice amplified by a megaphone. This is about every black man and woman who's been railroaded by a broken system. Angela Turner, Jamal's mother, approached Marcus, tears in her eyes. They're here because of you, she said, because you're willing to stand up. Marcus smiled faintly. They're here because they've had enough. I'm just giving them a voice. At home, The weight of the case began to take its toll. Marcus sat at the kitchen table with Lisa, who was visibly upset. "You're not sleeping, you're barely eating," Lisa said. "And now we've got reporters calling the house. This isn't just about the case anymore, it's about you." Marcus ran a hand over his face. "Lisa, I can't back down. If I let Hargrove win, it sets a precedent." Lisa slammed her hand on the table. "What about your daughter? What about me? We're the ones who'll have to pick up the pieces if this all falls apart." Marcus reached for her hand, his voice soft but firm. "I know it's hard, but I have to do this. For Jamal. For everyone who's been through this." Lisa pulled her hand away and left the room, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. In a dimly lit diner, Marcus met with Claire Daniels, the journalist who had been digging into Hargrove's past. "I've got something you need to see," Claire said, sliding a folder across the table. "It's a sworn affidavit from one of Hargrove's former clerks. He admits Hargrove influenced case outcomes to favor wealthy defendants." Marcus opened the folder, his eyes scanning the document. "This is a game changer." Claire leaned closer. "But if you use it, you'll be putting a target on your back. Hargrove has friends in high places." Marcus smirked. "Let him come after me. I'm not backing down." The courtroom was tense as Marcus introduced the affidavit as evidence of Hargrove's bias. The judge's face was a mask of barely contained rage. "This affidavit," Marcus said, holding it up for the jury to see, "comes from someone who worked directly under Judge Hargrove. It confirms a pattern of judicial misconduct." Hargrove interrupted, his voice thunderous. "Mr. Wright, you are out of line. I'll not allow this circus in my courtroom." Marcus faced the judge, his voice calm but defiant. "The truth isn't a circus, Your Honor. It's what this court is supposed to be about." The jury shifted uncomfortably, and the gallery whispered. The tension in the room was electric. In his chambers, Hargrove paced like a caged animal. His hands shook as he poured himself a drink. The pressure was mounting, and the cracks in his facade were beginning to show. "How dare he?" Hargrove muttered to himself. "That insolent." A knock at the door interrupted his rant. Ellen Foster entered, her expression grave. "Bill, this is getting out of hand. The media's all over this, and the protesters aren't going away." Hargrove slammed his glass on the desk. "I've handled worse. Wright's just another upstart who doesn't know his place." Foster hesitated. "Maybe it's time to step back." Hargrove glared at her. "Never." Marcus stood at a podium outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters. The affidavit and supporting evidence had been made public, and the press was hungry for a statement. "This is not just about one judge or one case," Marcus said, his voice steady and firm. "This is about a system that allows prejudice to flourish unchecked. It's time for accountability." The crowd of reporters shouted questions, but Marcus ignored them, walking away with Sheila by his side. "You think this will be enough?" Sheila asked. Marcus looked back at the courthouse, his face resolute. "It's a start." The newsroom buzzed with energy as Claire Daniels sat at her desk, typing furiously. Her latest article, "Bias on the Bench: Judge Hargrove's History of Prejudice Exposed," was already trending online. Television commentators debated the allegations. In his chambers, Judge Hargrove watched the news coverage, his jaw clenched. A commentator's voice filled the room. "If these allegations are true, it raises serious questions about the integrity of the justice system." Hargrove picked up the remote and turned off the TV. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues and friends, many expressing concern, a few offering support. He poured himself another drink, his hands trembling. Meanwhile, Marcus sat at his office desk, surrounded by Sheila and Jamal's family. Sheila scrolled through her phone. The stories everywhere. Hargrove's officially on the ropes. Angela, Jamal's mother, clasped Marcus's hands. "God bless you, Marcus. You're doing what no one else would." Marcus offered a small smile. "We're not done yet. This is just the beginning." Ellen Foster sat across from Hargrove in his chambers, her posture stiff. "Bill, this has gone too far. They've got evidence, witnesses, and now the media. You need to step down from this case." Hargrove's face darkened. I will not let some grandstanding lawyer and a mob of protesters dictate my courtroom. Bill, Ellen said, lowering her voice, if this blows up any further, it won't just be your reputation on the line. It'll affect everyone who's ever worked with you. Hargrove slammed his fist on the desk. I've given my life to this bench. I won't be driven out by lies. Ellen stood, her expression a mix of frustration and fear. If you don't step back, you're going to take us all down with you. The community center was packed, the energy palpable. Marcus stood at the front of the room, addressing a crowd of activists, legal advocates, and local leaders. This fight isn't just about one man or one case, Marcus said, his voice steady but passionate. It's about changing a system that's been stacked against us for generations. An elderly man in the back stood up, his voice shaky but firm. We've been fighting this fight for decades. What makes you think this time will be any different? Marcus stepped closer to the crowd, his eyes scanning the room. Because this time, we're not alone. We have the truth, the law, and the power of people behind us. The crowd erupted in applause. Angela approached Marcus afterward, tears streaming down her face. You've given us hope, Marcus. Don't let them take that away. Late at night, Hargrove sat alone in his chambers. His once pristine desk was cluttered with files, documents, and an empty glass. He flipped through the affidavit Claire Daniels had exposed, muttering under his breath. A knock at the door startled him. It was his clerk, a nervous young man holding a folder. What is it? Hargrove snapped. The clerk hesitated. Sir, the Judicial Review Board has launched an investigation into the allegations. Hargrove's face turned ashen. Get out. As the clerk left, Hargrove leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew the walls were closing in. Back at Marcus's office, Sheila burst through the door, holding another folder. You're not going to believe this, she said breathlessly. Marcus looked up from his desk. What is it? She handed him the folder. It's from Claire Daniels. She found more whistleblowers, 2 former clerks and a prosecutor who are willing to testify about Hargrove's misconduct. Marcus flipped through the statements, his eyes widening. This is it. This is the nail in the coffin. Sheila grinned. You're taking him down, Marcus. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a rare smile crossing his face. We're taking him down. The courtroom was tense as Marcus cross-examined a key prosecution witness, Peter Garrison. The gallery was packed, with reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Mr. Garrison, Marcus began, pacing slowly, isn't it true that you've been involved in prior disputes with individuals in the same neighborhood as Jamal Turner? Garrison shifted uncomfortably. I don't see how that's relevant. Marcus pressed on. Answer the question. Hargrove interrupted. Mr. Wright, this is your final warning. Stay on topic. Marcus turned to the judge, his tone sharp. Your Honor, I am on topic. This line of questioning establishes a pattern of behavior critical to my client's defense. The jury watched intently as Marcus continued. Isn't it also true, Mr. Garrison, that you were heard using racial slurs during an altercation with a neighbor just last year? Garrison's face reddened. That's a lie. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Marcus returned to his seat, satisfied that he'd planted doubt in the jury's minds. The courthouse steps were flooded with protesters. The chants of justice for Jamal echoed through the streets. Marcus joined the crowd, walking beside Angela and other community leaders. A reporter approached him. Mr. Wright, do you think the protest will influence the case? Marcus stopped, looking directly into the camera. This isn't about influencing the case. It's about holding people accountable and making sure everyone gets a fair shot at justice. As the march continued, Marcus felt a surge of hope. The momentum was building, and the tide was finally turning. In a stark conference room, Hargrove sat before a panel of Judicial Review Board members. The room was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to his ornate courtroom. Judge Hargrove, the chairman began, you've been accused of numerous instances of judicial misconduct, including conflicts of interest and racial bias. How do you respond? Hargrove straightened his tie, his voice firm but brittle. These accusations are baseless. My record speaks for itself. One of the panel members raised an eyebrow. Your record is precisely why we're here. As witnesses began to testify, including Marcus and the whistleblowers, Hargrove's composure began to crack. Each statement chipped away at his defense, leaving him increasingly isolated. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the defense prepared to rest its case. The jury, once skeptical, now appeared engaged and thoughtful. Marcus could see the seeds of doubt planted in their minds beginning to take root. Marcus stood before the jury for his closing arguments. His voice was calm yet resolute, carrying the weight of every injustice that had led to this moment. Jamal Turner is not on trial for what he did. He's on trial for who he is, Marcus said, pacing the floor. The prosecution has relied on assumptions, stereotypes, and a flawed system to paint a picture of guilt. But the truth, the evidence, tells a very different story. The jury watched intently as Marcus paused for effect, his gaze sweeping over them. This case is not just about Jamal. It's about whether we, as a society, will allow prejudice to dictate justice. I trust that you will see through the noise and render the only verdict that justice demands: not guilty. The prosecution offered a rebuttal, but the energy in the room had shifted. Even Judge Hargrove seemed uneasy, his usual domineering presence dulled by the scrutiny he faced. In a quiet corner of the courthouse, Ellen Foster met with Hargrove. Her face was pale, her voice low and urgent. "Bill, the jury's not buying it. If you keep pushing this, you're going to lose everything." Hargrove leaned against the wall, his hands gripping the edge of a table. "I can't just fold, Ellen. If I back down now, it's an admission of guilt." "It's too late for that," Ellen shot back. "You've already lost the public's trust. Your best move now is damage control." Hargrove shook his head, his jaw tight. "I'll fight to the end." Ellen sighed, realizing that Hargrove's pride would be his downfall. At home, Marcus sat in his dimly lit living room, a stack of papers on the coffee table in front of him. His phone buzzed. He answered without looking at the screen. "Right here." Claire Danielle's voice came through. "Marcus, I just got a tip. The Judicial Board is fast-tracking their investigation into Hargrove. Word is, they've already found enough to recommend suspension." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. "Are they making it public?" "Not yet," Claire said, "but it's only a matter of time. This could turn the tide completely." Marcus thanked her and hung up, his mind racing. The walls around Hargrove were crumbling faster than he'd anticipated. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in, their faces unreadable. The foreperson stood, holding a folded piece of paper in her trembling hands. "Have you reached a verdict?" Hargrove asked, his voice less commanding than usual. "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied. Marcus held his breath, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Jamal sat beside him, his face pale but calm. The foreperson unfolded the paper and read aloud. "In the case of the state versus Jamal Turner, we find the defendant not guilty." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Angela Turner broke into sobs, clutching her son's arm. Marcus exhaled deeply, a rare smile spreading across his face. Judge Hargrove banged his gavel weakly. Order in the court. But there was no stopping the celebration erupting in the gallery. After the verdict, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, bombarding Marcus and Jamal with questions. In the background, Hargrove slipped out through a side door, his head down and shoulders slumped. Inside his chambers, Hargrove stared at his reflection in the mirror. The once imposing judge now looked weary and defeated. His phone buzzed with a message from the Judicial Board. Suspension pending review. He slumped into his chair, his career unraveling before his eyes. That evening, the community gathered at the local center to celebrate the verdict. The room was alive with music, laughter, and hope. Jamal stood with his mother, surrounded by friends and supporters. Marcus entered quietly, trying to avoid the spotlight. But the crowd erupted in cheers when they saw him. Angela pulled him into a hug, tears in her eyes. "You saved my boy," she whispered. "You saved us." Marcus smiled, his voice soft. "You saved yourselves. I just gave you the tools." Back in his office, Marcus sat alone, staring at the photograph of his late father. He picked it up, his fingers brushing the frame. "I did it, Dad," he murmured. "But there's still so much more to do." Sheila knocked on the door, poking her head in. "You've got a dozen new client requests. Looks like you're in demand." Marcus chuckled. "Bring them on." The following week, the Judicial Review Board announced its findings. Hargrove's misconduct was confirmed, and he was officially suspended from the bench. News outlets ran the story non-stop, his face plastered across every screen. Marcus watched the coverage from his office. Claire Daniels' voice narrated the segment. "Today's decision marks a turning point in the fight for accountability in the justice system." Sheila entered, holding a newspaper. "They're calling it the right effect." "You've started something, Marcus." Marcus smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the TV. "This isn't the end. It's just the beginning." The camera panned out as Marcus turned back to his work, his resolve unshaken, ready to tackle the next battle. Judge Hargrove's suspension was the top headline across all major news outlets. Sitting in his lavish home, now eerily silent, he watched a televised report about his misconduct. A panel of commentators dissected his career, the exposed biases, and the damning evidence that led to his downfall. "This is a victory for justice," one commentator said, "but it also exposes how much work remains to be done." Hargrove's hands trembled as he turned off the television. His phone buzzed with a text from an old colleague. "Bill, you've been disbarred from more than the courtroom. Don't try to reach out again." He stared at the message, his world crumbling. The influence he once wielded was gone, leaving only the harsh reality of his actions. Marcus sat in his office late at night, the room dim except for the soft glow of his desk lamp. A copy of the day's newspaper lay open before him, the headline reading, "A Judge Falls, the System Under Scrutiny." Sheila walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You've been staring at that article for hours," she said, placing one on his desk. Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's a win, but it doesn't feel like enough. For every Hargrove, there are a dozen more out there." Sheila sat across from him. "You've made people believe change is possible. That's not nothing." Marcus nodded, but remained pensive. "Now we have to make sure it lasts." In a quiet diner, Marcus met with Jamal and his mother, Angela. Jamal looked lighter, as though the weight of the trial had finally lifted. "I've been thinking," Jamal said. "I want to go back to school. Maybe study law." Marcus smiled. "The world needs more lawyers like you." Angela clasped Marcus's hand across the table. "We wouldn't be here without you. You gave us hope when we didn't have any." Marcus shook his head. "You already had hope. You just needed someone to amplify it." At the local community center, a panel discussion was underway, featuring Marcus, Claire Daniels, and a civil rights activist. The room was packed with people eager to hear about the next steps in the fight for justice. Marcus spoke with conviction. Hargrove's case is just the tip of the iceberg. Systemic change requires systemic action. That means voting, organizing, and holding everyone in power accountable. A young woman in the audience raised her hand. "How can we fight back if the system is so stacked against us?" Marcus leaned forward. "By working together. No one person can fix this, but when we pool our voices and resources, we become unstoppable." The room erupted in applause. In his dimly lit study, Hargrove sat at his desk, scribbling in a notebook. His once proud demeanor was gone, replaced by a broken, introspective man. He had begun drafting a letter to the editor of a prominent newspaper. "I acknowledge my failures and the harm I've caused," he wrote. "My actions perpetuated a system of injustice, and for that, I am deeply sorry." He paused, staring at the words. Could he change public perception? Could he atone for years of bias? With a sigh, he folded the letter and set it aside, unsure if he'd ever send it. Back in his office, Marcus sifted through a growing pile of case files. Each one represented another fight, another person in need of justice. Sheila walked in, holding a thick folder. "This one's urgent," she said. "A wrongful conviction case. The guy's been in prison for 15 years. Marcus took the folder, his determination renewed. "Let's get to work." Marcus's battle was far from over, but he was ready to face it. The Judicial Review Board convened in a grand hall, their decision about Hargrove's future eagerly awaited. The chairperson addressed the packed room. After careful deliberation, we find that Judge Hargrove's actions violated the ethical standards of the judiciary. Effective immediately, he is permanently disbarred from practicing law. Applause broke out among the attendees. In the back of the room, Claire Daniels scribbled notes for her next article, while Marcus nodded in quiet satisfaction. Next day, at a rally organized by Marcus and other local leaders, the courthouse steps, once a symbol of oppression, now served as a platform for hope and change. Marcus addressed the crowd, his voice strong. This is about more than one case, one judge, or one courtroom. It's about building a system that works for everyone, and we can only do that together. As the crowd cheered, Marcus stepped back, allowing other speakers to take the stage. The camera panned out, showing the growing movement that Marcus had helped spark. Marcus sat at a round table with prominent legal minds, civil rights activists, and policy advocates in a spacious, modern conference room. The discussion was intense, revolving around systemic reforms. A sharp-tongued activist, Dr. Vanessa Taylor, leaned forward, her voice sharp. Exposing Hargrove was a win, but it doesn't fix the system. We need policy change, mandatory oversight, judicial diversity, and transparency. Marcus nodded. Agreed. We also need to train and empower the next generation. The law is only as strong as the people willing to fight for it. A young law professor chimed in. Marcus, you've got the platform now. If you push for these reforms, people will listen. Marcus hesitated, sensing the weight of the expectations being placed on him. I'm ready to push, but this has to be a collective fight. One voice can spark change, but it takes many to sustain it. The meeting ended with a tentative plan to draft a bill for judicial accountability, spearheaded by Marcus and a coalition of lawyers and activists. At the same time, dissent brewed among the old guard of the legal community. In a dark-paneled club frequented by retired judges and prominent lawyers, a heated discussion unfolded. A former judge, Samuel Whitmore, sipped his whiskey, scowling. Marcus Wright is a firebrand. He's dangerous. If he gets his way, no judge will ever feel secure. Another lawyer chimed in. He's not just targeting Hargrove. He's making us all look corrupt. Whitmore slammed his glass on the table. We built this system. He doesn't get to tear it down. Unbeknownst to Marcus, a campaign to discredit him was quietly forming, aiming to paint him as a radical intent on dismantling the judiciary. At a nearby university, Marcus gave a guest lecture to a packed auditorium of law students. He stood at the podium, speaking with measured passion. Law is a powerful tool, he said, his voice resonating in the room, but it's only as fair as the people who wield it. You are the future of this system, and you have the power to shape it. A student raised her hand. How do we deal with the people who resist change? The ones who think exposing someone like Hargrove is going too far. Marcus smiled. You remind them that justice isn't about comfort. It's about truth, and truth often makes people uncomfortable. The room erupted in applause. After the lecture, a small group of students approached Marcus, eager to learn more about his work. He saw in their eyes the determination he once felt as a young lawyer, giving him hope for the future. Late one evening, Marcus returned home to find an unmarked envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a crude note scrawled in red ink, "Stay out of our courts, or you'll regret it." Marcus's wife, Lisa, found him staring at the note. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling, "this is serious. What if they—" "They won't," Marcus interrupted, though his own voice betrayed unease. "They're scared because they're losing. That's all this is." Lisa grabbed his hand. "Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me this won't cost us more than it already has." Marcus nodded, but his resolve only hardened. He knew the threats were a sign he was on the right path. In a dingy motel room, Hargrove met with Samuel Whitmore. The once proud judge now looked disheveled, his suit wrinkled and his eyes hollow. "You said you'd help me rebuild," Hargrove growled. "Instead, I've been left to rot." Whitmore poured a drink, unbothered by Hargrove's anger. "You're toxic now, Bill, But that doesn't mean you can't still be useful. What do you mean? Hargrove asked, suspicious. We leak a story, Whitmore said. Something to make Wright look like the zealot he is. Remind people that he's just as dangerous as the system he's fighting. Hargrove hesitated, but his bitterness outweighed his caution. Do it. The next day, news outlets picked up a scandalous story. Radical lawyer Marcus Wright. Is he destroying justice? The piece accused Marcus of seeking to dismantle the judiciary entirely, framing him as a destabilizing force. At his office, Marcus watched the coverage with a mix of frustration and determination. Sheila burst in, holding her phone. It's all over social media. They're calling you a tyrant. Marcus sighed. We knew they'd fight that. We just need to stay the course. Sheila crossed her arms. We need to fight back harder. Let's hit them with more evidence. Prove this isn't about tearing down the system. It's about rebuilding it. Marcus nodded. Let's do it. Claire Daniels aired an investigative piece in response to the smear campaign, exposing the orchestrated nature of the attacks on Marcus. This isn't about preserving justice, she said on camera. It's about protecting the old guard's grip on power. Marcus Wright isn't dismantling justice. He's saving it. The segment featured interviews with Jamal Turner, Angela, and community leaders, all praising Marcus's integrity and determination. The tide began to turn. Public opinion, once divided, rallied behind Marcus. Protests and rallies gained momentum, calling for broader reforms. Marcus received a surprising phone call from a state senator who had been following his work. Mr. Wright, the senator said, we're drafting legislation for judicial accountability, and we'd like you to consult on it. Marcus hesitated, his mind racing. I'm a lawyer, not a politician. Exactly, the senator replied. We need someone who understands the real-world impact of these laws. Someone who's seen the system's failures up close. After a long pause, Marcus agreed. I'll do it, but only if it leads to real change. The act ends with Marcus standing in front of the state capitol, surrounded by activists and reporters. He looked out at the crowd, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders, but balanced by the hope of a better future. The senator's office was a whirlwind of activity. Papers and charts covered the long conference table, and interns darted in and out, carrying reports and coffee. Marcus sat at the head of the table, surrounded by lawyers, activists, and policymakers. We need to ensure this bill has teeth, Marcus said, scanning a draft of the proposed legislation. Judicial accountability can't just be about transparency. It has to come with consequences. A young legislative aide raised her hand. What about mandating third-party oversight for judges accused of bias? Marcus nodded. Good start. Add a provision for mandatory public reporting of judicial rulings, broken down by demographic impact. Let the people see the patterns. The senator entered the room, her expression serious but determined. We have 2 weeks to finalize this before the committee vote. Let's make it count. In a luxurious downtown boardroom, Samuel Whitmore convened a meeting of conservative judges, lawyers, and lobbyists. The room buzzed with outrage over the proposed reforms. This bill is an attack on our independence as judges, a middle-aged judge declared. We can't let it pass. Whitmore stood, his presence commanding. This isn't just about one bill. It's about preserving the foundation of our legal system. If Marcus Wright gets his way, every judge in this country will be under a microscope. How do we stop him? Another lawyer asked. Whitmore smirked. We exploit his weakest link, his idealism. He's too principled to play dirty. But we're not. At a crowded town hall, Marcus stood before a diverse group of community members, explaining the proposed reforms. Behind him, a large banner read, Justice for All. Support judicial accountability. This bill is about making sure no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law, Marcus said. Judges are supposed to serve the people, not their own biases or interests. A young man in the crowd raised his hand. But what if they find a way to shut this down? They've got more power, more money. Marcus's voice grew stronger. They may have resources, but we have numbers. Change doesn't happen because it's easy. It happens because people demand it. The crowd erupted in applause, the energy palpable. Jamal Turner, standing in the front row, turned to Angela. "He's giving people hope, just like he gave us." Late at night, Marcus worked alone in his office, poring over revisions to the bill. A loud thud outside startled him. He opened the door cautiously and found a brick with a note tied to it. "Back off, or else." Marcus's heart raced, but he quickly called the police. Sheila arrived shortly after, furious. "They're trying to scare you off. You can't just ignore this." "I'm not ignoring it," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "But I won't let them intimidate me either." Sheila shook her head. "You're risking too much, Marcus." Marcus looked her in the eye. "If we don't fight now, when will we?" Marcus met with leaders from other reform movements, labor unions, education advocates, and even environmental groups, to build a coalition of support for the bill. "This isn't just about the courts," Marcus explained. "It's about creating a system that works for everyone." One union leader, a gruff man in his 50s, leaned back in his chair. "You're asking us to back a fight we might not win." Marcus nodded. "I am. But if we don't fight, we're guaranteeing that we lose." After a tense pause, the union leader extended his hand. "You've got our support." The state capitol was packed for the public hearing on the bill. Marcus, dressed in a sharp navy suit, sat at the witness table, ready to testify. Opposing him was Samuel Whitmore, who represented a coalition of judges and attorneys. Whitmore spoke first, his tone measured but scathing. "This bill is a reckless overreach. It undermines the independence of the judiciary and opens the door to frivolous accusations." When it was Marcus's turn, he rose with quiet confidence. "With all due respect, this bill doesn't undermine judicial independence, it reinforces it. Accountability is not the enemy of justice. Bias is." He presented data on racial disparities in rulings and shared powerful stories from affected communities. The room was silent as he finished, his words resonating deeply. Outside the hearing, reporters swarmed Marcus, firing rapid questions. One asked, "Do you think you've done enough to sway the committee?" Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think the truth speaks for itself. Now it's up to our leaders to decide if they're willing to act on it." Meanwhile, Claire Daniels aired a segment that evening titled, "A Reckoning for the Judiciary?" The report contrasted Marcus's evidence with Whitmore's arguments, clearly favoring the reforms. The legislative committee convened a vote on the bill. The tension in the chamber was palpable. Marcus, Sheila, and several community leaders sat in the gallery, their eyes fixed on the proceedings. The chairperson called for the roll. One by one, legislators cast their votes. When the final tally was read, Marcus held his breath. The motion passes. The bill moves to the full legislature. The room erupted in applause. Sheila hugged Marcus tightly. "You did it." Marcus shook his head. "We took the first step. Now we have to finish the race." The state legislature was in session, the chamber filled with representatives, journalists, and lobbyists. The Judicial Accountability Bill, now dubbed the Right Reform Act by the media, was up for debate. Marcus sat in the gallery, his gaze locked on the proceedings. The senior legislator, known for opposing the bill, stood to speak. "This bill sets a dangerous precedent. It opens our judges to politically motivated attacks and weakens the very foundation of our judiciary." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Another legislator, an ally of Marcus's cause, countered passionately, "This isn't about politics, it's about justice. The data is clear. Unchecked bias has ruined lives and eroded public trust. This bill restores accountability where it's desperately needed." Marcus watched intently, his hands clasped tightly. The debate raged on, each side trading arguments, as the fate of the bill hung in the balance. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit hotel room, Judge Hargrove met with Samuel Whitmore and a few influential figures from the legal establishment. Desperate to maintain their grip on power, they planned a last-minute smear campaign against Marcus. Hargrove's voice was bitter. "If we can't stop the vote, we discredit the man behind it. Leak his old cases, twist his victories into attacks on the system. Make the public question his motives." Whitmore hesitated for the first time. "We've thrown everything at him, Bill. If we push too hard and this backfires, We're finished. Hargrove's eyes burned with desperation. Then it's a risk we take. The next morning, headlines accused Marcus of manipulating cases for his own gain. Tabloids claimed he sought to dismantle the judiciary to elevate his career. Social media erupted, with supporters and detractors clashing over the allegations. At his office, Marcus paced furiously. Sheila read the headlines aloud. "They're twisting your old eviction cases, saying you bent the rules to protect tenants." Marcus ran a hand through his hair. Those cases were about protecting people who were being exploited. Sheila slammed the papers onto his desk. "They know that. They're just scared. What's the plan?" Marcus stopped pacing, his jaw tightening. "We fight back with facts. I've got nothing to hide." Marcus held a press conference outside the courthouse, surrounded by supporters, including Jamal Turner and his mother. The crowd buzzed with anticipation as Marcus stepped up to the podium. "The allegations against me are nothing more than a distraction," he said firmly. "They want you to focus on me because they can't defend the system they've created. But this isn't about me. It's about the people who've been denied justice for far too long." Jamal stepped forward, his voice strong. "Marcus Wright stood by me when no one else would. If you're looking for someone to blame, look at the people who've been hiding behind that bench for years." The crowd erupted in cheers, and the momentum shifted back in Marcus's favor. As the vote approached, protest erupted outside the state capitol. Thousands gathered, chanting for justice and holding signs that read "Accountability now" and "Pass the Right Reform Act." Marcus addressed the crowd, his voice booming over the megaphone. "This fight isn't over. Today, we stand together to demand a system that serves everyone, not just the powerful." The protest grew so large that it made national news, putting additional pressure on legislators to act. Inside the state legislature, tension filled the air as representatives cast their votes. Marcus sat with Sheila and the community leaders, watching anxiously. The clerk read each vote aloud, the outcome coming down to a handful of undecided representatives. One of the undecideds stood to explain his vote. "I've wrestled with this decision, but after hearing the voices of my constituents, I vote in favor of the Right Reform Act." Applause broke out in the gallery. The final tally was read. The motion passes by a narrow margin. The Right Reform Act is now law. Tears streamed down Angela Turner's face as she hugged Marcus. Sheila cheered loudly, and the gallery erupted in applause. Marcus sat back, overwhelmed but victorious. The following day, investigations into the smear campaign revealed Hargrove's and Whitmore's involvement. The media turned against them, painting them as desperate figures clinging to a crumbling system. Hargrove watched the coverage from his now empty home. His phone buzzed with a message: "Your judicial pension is being reviewed." He slumped into his chair, defeated. Whitmore faced disbarment as his connections unraveled. His once formidable network of allies distanced themselves, leaving him isolated and disgraced. The final moment of the story takes place at a public celebration held on the courthouse steps. The community gathered to mark the passage of the Right Reform Act, a milestone in the fight for justice. Marcus stood at the podium, flanked by Jamal, Angela, Sheila, and other community leaders. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. "This victory belongs to all of you," he said. "It proves that when we stand together, no system, no matter how entrenched, can withstand the power of truth and justice. But this is not the end. It's the beginning of a long road toward equity and fairness. And I promise, I will walk that road with you." The crowd cheered as Marcus stepped down, shaking hands and embracing those who had supported him. As the sun set over the courthouse, the camera panned out, showing the diverse crowd united in hope. The story ends with Marcus walking away from the courthouse, his head held high, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The fight for justice is never truly over. Stand for what's right. Stand for change. Subscribe for more stories that inspire justice and change.